Hey there, everybody. Professor Cloud here, or Brian if you would prefer. In previous videos, we've talked about any number of different topics with respect to Azure. In this video and correlating article, we're going to be talking about isolation of databases inside of Azure. And when I talk about databases, I'm talking about everything from Azure SQL, Azure Postgres, all the way to Cosmos DB. And if you'll notice, all of those are platform databases. So I'm not going to be talking about infrastructure services. I'm not going to be talking about how you would deploy Azure SQL or Microsoft SQL on a Azure VM and how you would isolate that. That is not going to be any different than if you were isolating anything else inside of infrastructure as a service. I want to focus specifically on platform as a service. And the reason why is because in some interactions I've had with customers recently, there's been some confusion. There's been confusion because there are multiple ways, depending upon the flavor of database, of how you would isolate your database. In this video, we're going to specifically talk about the private endpoint method of isolating your database. Now, what do I mean by isolation of your database? I'm talking about traffic, network traffic. How are you going to make sure, one, that your database doesn't have a public endpoint, and two, how can you also guarantee that the traffic flowing to that database is what is supposed to be flowing to that database? What applications are connecting to it that should be? What users are connecting to it, if any, that should be? And that's where isolation of your database at the network level really comes into play. As I said in this video, we're going to be talking about private endpoints. So let's go ahead and jump into the Azure portal, and using Azure SQL as my example, we'll talk about how to actually do that. So here we are in the Azure portal. I already have a virtual network set up. And as you can see here in the virtual network under subnets, I have three distinct subnets. I have a SQL subnet, a Postgres subnet, and a Bastion subnet. Now what we're going to do is we're going to deploy a brand new Azure SQL instance into the SQL subnet and make sure that it is locked down with a private endpoint, thereby guaranteeing, one, there is no public endpoint to that Azure SQL instance, but then number two, that you have all of the same capabilities from a networking perspective to prevent who or whatever should not be accessing that database, using things like network security groups, application security groups, Azure Firewall, and so on. Now, one thing that you will need to understand is, why am I talking about two different types of isolation? What services support each one? All of that information can be found in the corresponding article that's associated with these two videos, and the URL for that article can be found in the description of this video if you happen to be watching it on YouTube and not directly from the article itself. But there are certain services inside of Azure that support the private endpoint method, and there are certain services inside of Azure that support the virtual network integration method. And there are reasonings behind that, and I go into more detail about that in the article. So first, let's go ahead and create a brand new SQL instance, and we will do that from the resource group itself. Now, there absolutely are ways to use existing resources such as existing SQL servers and set them up with private endpoints, or existing databases and set them up with private endpoints. But I want to show you from a blank slate how you would go about it, and then show you inside of those resources where you can modify or where you can add private endpoints should you want to do it in one of your existing resources. So here we are with Azure SQL. We'll go ahead and click Create. And when the portal responds, there we go. So in this instance, we're going to be focusing on single database. What I am describing, though, will work for Elastic Pools. It does not, though, work for SQL Managed Instance or SQL Virtual Machines. And the reasoning behind that is both of those fall under infrastructure-based isolation requirements. So you're going to have VMs or VM scale sets, and you're going to isolate those into subnets, and you're going to set up network security groups. You're going to do all of the standard things that you would do with infrastructure as a service. But with SQL databases, you don't have access to that infrastructure layer. So you need to understand how to actually isolate the platform service. So we click single database, and we already have our resource group set for us. We're going to be creating a brand new server. So let's go ahead and give this a name, Isolated Server, DB Server. We're going to set this up in South Central because that's been my preferred region. And just for demonstration's sake, I am going to go ahead and just use SQL authentication. Now, keep in mind, that's probably not the best practice, especially for production level databases. But for demonstration purposes, it works fantastic. So we're going through the process right now of creating the server. It's going to go ahead and pre-populate. Then we're going to create a database name. And I'm just going to call this DemoDB for easy purposes. I'm going to leave everything else the same. We're not going to be using Elastic Pools. We're not going to switch from production to development. It really doesn't matter. And I'm going to go ahead and leave the general purpose compute and storage alone. Where things really become important, though, is over here on the networking layer. In the networking tab, the very first area is connectivity. And the first thing you want to make sure of is that you do not have public endpoints selected. By default, no access is selected, and that's the most secure option, thereby allowing you to deploy the database without giving anyone access until you're really truly ready to make it available for usage. But in my instance, for demonstration purposes, again, we're just going to go ahead and select Private Endpoint. Now, I don't have any private endpoints that have been set up for the server, and I want to make sure to mention this. No matter how many databases you deploy in this server, all of them will use the same private endpoint, because the endpoint at the end of the day is a NIC card that has been attached to the server that we just created. And that is how your platform service can be guaranteed to sit inside of your subnet. So let's go ahead and click Add Private Endpoint. Again, the region's already been selected. The resource group has already been selected. We're going to go ahead and choose a name for this, SQL Endpoint. And then you'll notice my VNet has already been selected as well. Now, granted, it's the only VNet that I have available. It's also the only VNet that I have available inside of the resource group, inside of the same region. The same region is absolutely a requirement. Then we can specify which subnet we want this instance to go into. So we're going to go ahead and choose SQL. Do we want to use private DNS zones? That's completely up to you. That's an Azure DNS discussion. You might already have your own DNS servers set up inside of your infrastructure or your architecture somewhere else. So I'm going to go ahead and select no and select OK. Now what's going to happen is it's going to go ahead and create the private endpoint behind the scenes and attach that to the SQL server that we created. We'll then go to security. You can turn on a number of different features that are security oriented, such as Microsoft Defender, the Ledger service, depending upon if you want to have system assigned or user assigned identities for things like Azure Functions to attach to your SQL server, you can make that happen, as well as transparent data encryption. Do you want to have that turned on? Because that is a database level feature. I'm going to leave everything alone. We then can turn on some things like, where does the data come from? Do you want it to be empty? What kind of collation? So on and so forth. Go ahead to tags, review and create, and we're off and running. And that's how simple it is to set up a private endpoint. Now, as soon as this process is completed and the server, database, and private endpoints are completed, I'm going to make sure to show you everything inside of the resource group, because I want to make sure to point out what everything was behind the scenes that was actually made available to make this happen. Okay, so here we are back in the resource group. You'll notice there are quite a few more resources showing up. The first, of course, is the virtual network. The next is there is a network interface. And as I mentioned, in order for a private endpoint to be created from a software developed networking perspective, there needs to be a NIC card of some kind, something that has an IP address. That private endpoint then connects to that and says, this NIC card is only going to be associated with a particular VNet and a particular subnet, and it's going to only allow traffic from the virtual network and subnet by default to connect to that private endpoint. Because remember, in a platform service, there is no existing VM sitting in the virtual network. You will never be able to see this SQL server sitting in that virtual network. But this guarantees that the isolation layer has been created. We then have the private endpoint. I'm not really sure why they're duplicated. It's probably just a UI bug because I've never seen this before. And then we have the SQL server and we have the database itself. Now, in order to validate and verify that everything is working as it should, you will go into the server itself, not the database. And then under the server, specifically in security, is where you're going to find the networking layer. And this is where if you click under, well, first of all, under public access, you should see it disabled, as you would expect. The next is under private access, you should see that endpoint existing and connecting to the server. Now, you can have multiple private endpoints for the same database instance. If you want to have a database available via two different virtual networks, you can. Or, based on software-defined networking, you can also set up VNet peering, keep the server inside of one VNet, thereby removing the need to set up multiple network security groups or firewall rules and things like that. But this is how you're going to isolate your Azure SQL instance. This same method will also be used for other platform-based databases inside of Azure, such as Azure MySQL, Azure PostgreSQL, and Azure MariaDB. It can also be used for Azure Cosmos. However, there are some new capabilities and new deployment models for Azure SQL, for Azure PostgreSQL, and I believe Azure MySQL that allow for a different type of isolation when it comes to your platform databases. And we're going to talk about that in a subsequent video that'll also be associated with the same article. Now, for that complete list of supported private endpoint-based databases, there is an article down in the additional resources section of the article that I wrote that will point you to the Azure documentation that gives you that full list. And as always, if you've enjoyed this content, found it useful, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. Please make sure to hit the like button, and I'll see you soon.